Welcome. Today is the 29th day of Sivan, the 5th of July, and we're in the middle of chapter 2 of Shoresh Mitzvat Tefillah. And well, we talked about a lot of things yesterday that were actually will be discussed later in the subsequent chapters. Just to get an overview, I should have started with that in the very beginning. He started with the question of Shema and the Amida. Remember that this whole thing that we can only do the unifications when we're sitting down. We can't do it when we're standing up, because when we're sitting down, we're in the world of creation. When we're standing up, in the world of emanation. He's only going to get back to that in chapter 11. And actually, from chapter 2 and on is all a discussion about the relationship between the Sefirot and God's names, and to understand this properly. Because this was one of the major questions that came up, especially with Rabbi Moses Cordovero, the Ramak. He dedicates a lot of this to his discussions in the Pardes. And interestingly, the Arizal didn't talk about this so much. He just sort of assumed people knew how this worked. And it didn't really gel into a systematic understanding until the time of Chassidus. It wasn't really discussed. And then it turns out that there are 4 different shitos on how to understand this relationship. Anyway, he's going to present the one that Chassidus goes according to. And again, this is a very important question, because we're davening, we're using all these names of God, so what's going on? Okay. So and I also foreshadowed the discussion in the Rashba, which he here brings from a different point of view, from the Rivash, who was another one of the giants of the Spanish period, the very end of the Spanish period. Rabbi Yehuda Bar Sheshet, I think, was Bar Sheshet for sure. I don't remember the Yud, the Yosef or Yehuda. And his shoot is also very, very exceptionally important. And he also has these types of discussions with Mukubalim, and he also comes up with the same formulation of I mean, when I daven, I mean to daven to what the child intends to daven to, which is God amorphic, without any. And then he will discuss, so why is it that we still know this? Like, why do we still need to know these things? Okay, well, we'll get to that when we get to chapter 11. Okay, so just to know that in the next few chapters, not very long, it's about 3 pages here, we're going to be discussing this relationship between the Sefirot and the names. Okay, so last time we were towards the end of chapter 2. Where exactly were we? Vimken. Since every one of these names is really a name for God, it means God's essence, He Himself. How can you say that one name is associated with Chesed? Why is it that Kel, Aleph Lamed, is associated with Chesed, Elokim with Gvura? Chesed is a creation. So why would you attribute God Himself to a certain creation? Like, that's the question here. Even though it is a divine force, meaning it's a created force, it's not like that you would say a table, a chair, a snail, a tree. These are completely creatures that are disconnected from godliness. You don't see within the snail or the tree or the table, you don't see the godliness. But in the Sefirah you can say, yes, it's divine. We call them Sefirot Elokiyot. We call them Still, it's not He Himself. It's a creation. The Sefirot are creations. They are actually things. Remember, I think I told you once that one of the first questions I asked Rav Ginsburg when I met him, it was like 30 years ago, are the Sefirot things? Or are they just mental objects? Maybe it's just a mental category.
Yes, right.
He said, no, they're things.
It's a thing.
It's something that God had to create. The fact that I also can have a representation of something that's created is not a big question, because I have representations of everything in my mind. I have representations of snails and trees also. Right? Yeah. So it doesn't mean anything, the fact that it's a mental representation. It's an actual thing. And the mashal for this, the parable for this would be our thought, which even though it's not the soul itself, thought is a power of the soul. It's not the soul itself.
Right.
That's why, in a certain sense, we don't even categorize man as a thinker. We categorize him as a speaker, because speech is actually closer to the soul than thinking. Still, thinking is one of the powers of the soul. It's one of the faculties that the soul, when it enters the brain, is able to carry out. ויש בזה אריכות דברים להתאים הנמשל למעלה ונתבהר במקום אחר. There's a lengthy discussion of this somewhere else. על כל פנים, in any case. כן הוא כדפרישט שהספירה הנ"ל אף על פי שהן אלוקות, הספירות הנ"ל אף על פי שהן אלוקות, אינם עצמות הבורא ממש חס וחלילה. In any case, what we mean to say is that the Sefirot, even though they are godly, they are divine, they can be predicated as divine, they are not God himself. So we come back to our question. So why do you attribute the name Kel to Chesed? So if you're attributing it to Chesed, so now you've lost what you just said, that Kel itself is a name of God himself. So when you do this, you're confusing me. So why are you attributing the name Kel specifically to one Sefirah and not to another? It should have been that it could match all the Sefirot, because it's the name of God himself. Really, these names do mean God. Still, he wants now to strengthen our understanding that the names do relate to God. And he gives another example. He said, now we're dealing with connotations. Now it's not names. And he says Shechina, for instance. Shechina is a connotation. When did Shechina start? In the time of Joshua. In the time of Joshua, we already find that he uses the word Shechina. Joshua, the judges, they all use the word Shechina because of the Mishkan, apparently, because God said, "I will dwell amongst them." So it was called the dwelling, and it's a connotation. So even though it refers to God Himself, it's a connotation. And the Kabbalists later called it Nukva Deza, the feminine of the small countenance.
Of the small
countenance, meaning the small face.
Yeah.
Ze'er Anpin. And we see that the sages, they really use this word to connote God Himself, not some aspect of God.
Shechina, the
right, the
Shechina,
right?
Yes. Okay.
For instance, in the saying, Akol asara, akol beyasra, shechinta sharia. On every 10 people that convene, the Shechina comes down. What do we mean? We mean that God is there. And the proof is that there was a heretic, in this case, every time it says min in the Talmud, it means a Christian. So a Christian asked, or somebody who was an Ovid of Avodah Zarah, in any case, he asked Rabban. Back then, they weren't like the Protestants, which are closer to not being like that. Back then, they really were still idolatrous, the early Christians. And he asked Rabban Gamliel, how many Shechinas do you have? Because if you say every 10 people have the Shechina upon them, so what is he doing? He's understanding that the connotation is not God Himself, or at least he doesn't understand God's unity. He doesn't understand what it means that God can be in many places at the same time. He doesn't understand omnipresence yet. It's a concept that's not yet in this heretic's vocabulary. He doesn't understand it. So Rabban Gamliel, he gave him a mashal, he gave him a parable. He said, Mashal le'or hashemesh. This is like the rays of the sun that enter into multiple houses. The sun is only one, but its rays, its light, goes into very many dwellings. So you understand from the question and the answer. מובן והשיב זה ששכינה היינו אור וגילוי מאין סוף ברוך הוא ממש שהאור מעין המאור ממש ולא ספירה ומידה פרטית. So here you see that this connotation, Shechina, even though it's not a holy name, it's not one of the names that you can't erase, it's not any of those things. It's just a connotation. Still, it refers to God Himself. And what we mean is that it refers to the revelation of God, but all these revelations are of the source. The same way that the light inside the room is from the sun. It didn't come from a different sun. It didn't come from another source. For us, of course, it does, because we have electricity, but for them, in their time, all the light that they had was from the sun. Mm-hmm. And so in every room that you found light, it was from the same source. And you can't say that it's something separate. It's not distinct. It's not a sefira in this case. It's not a separate creation from the sun. It is the sun itself. And because of this confusion, that a person might think that Nukva Deza, this name that the Kabbalists use, is something separate from God, the Baal Shem Tov commanded his disciples, who were not yet versed in this sugya, in what we're learning now, shelo lilmod sifrei Kabbalah. He told them not to learn directly from the books of Kabbalah, because they'll make this mistake. They'll read about the myriad names and the myriad connotations, and they'll come to an understanding of this is something separate from God. And that is close to, that's what we call close to being shniut, duplicity. Meaning having like two gods. That you think that there's, that a creation can be, now, it's not by mistake that I said before that Amin is a Christian, because that exactly is at the core of the problem with Christianity. That they take something that is a creation and they confuse it for being something separate from God. And they make it into something godly as if it stands by itself. And then they get into this whole confusion. So in a certain sense, and this is well known, I'm not saying anything new, Chassidus was a rectification for Christianity. Yeah. The two people who worked the most to do that are the Baal Shem Tov himself, who explained all of this the right way, and then his great-grandson, Reb Nachman. Reb Nachman of Breslov took upon himself directly to take the fallacies, the mistakes of Christianity, and to fix them. Yeah. One of the main things that he did was confession. Right? So he took confession, which in Christianity becomes something almost macabre. I don't know how to describe it. It's morose. Yeah. And he rectified it. And he incorporated it into his Chassidus.
This was a kavanah?
Yeah, it was on purpose. Because he wanted there to be a rectified version of what confession means. And he discusses it a lot. He says how important it is to come to the tzaddik and to tell him everything that's on your heart. It's no different than a psychologist, right? Because when you go to a psychologist, it's basically the same thing. And I think I talked about this a few days ago in a Yom Yom, I think on Tuesday. It wasn't on Tuesday, it was on Monday. That somebody once came to the Rebbe and he asked him, why do people adore you so much? What's so special about you? That's an interesting question to ask the Rebbe. What do you think about yourself? So the Rebbe said, because I'm a friend. So this guy says, friends? I have a lot of friends. Like, what makes you so special? He says, I'll explain to you what a friend is and then you decide. A friend is someone you can talk to as if you're talking to yourself. So that's the type of friend I am. That you can speak everything, you can say everything you want, there's no judgment, there's no...
Yeah.
That is true confession. You can confess to yourself in the same way you can, but you need someone else to... A human being does need to be able to share this with someone else. That's really the nature of having a confession. And that's what Reb Nachman was aiming at. So he said, of course there's a good part to it, but it's not because I can forgive your sins. There's nothing to do with that. That's not what confession is about. Confession is about being able to share, to release the burden that you have on you. It's not because I can offer you absolvence. I can't absolve you, only God absolves. Right.
I mean, it's the same.
Right. A person will come to the priest instead of bring the korban.
Yeah.
The priest is only an intermediary.
Yes.
It says, if you come to me as a friend and you talk to me as a tzaddik even, whatever it is, I can't absolve you of your sin, but you need that for your well-being. Yeah. So, in any case, because of this, Baal Shem Tov discouraged his disciples from studying Kabbalah directly. Because, and this is a general problem with learning Kabbalah directly, a person who doesn't know how to abstract the concepts from their physical terms, he becomes very coarse by learning Kabbalah. Because Kabbalah, again, it sounds like these are separate things from God, they stand alone, it's this, it's that, and when you're praying to this, you're praying to that. The Baal Shem Tov discouraged people who don't understand this sugya, but which we're now going to deal with until chapter 10, 11 actually, he discouraged people from studying it directly. So what the Tzemach Tzedek is going to do now, and this is like the end of the introduction basically, is going to go through the whole sugya to explain to us, so why is it in the end that we have Chesed Gvura Tiferes Netzach Hod and so on? Why is it that we attribute names to them? כשנותן ציור בעניות דעתו ללוקותו לפי מידות פרטים, ואף על פי שדברי אריז"ל הם נאמנים ואמיתיים. And of course the disclaimer is that of course everything the Arizal said is true and verified. There's no question. כשקרוא שכינה למידת מלכות כן הוא באמת. When he says that Shechina is Malchus, that's 100% true. וכן הוא באמת שם כל בחסד ושם אלוקים בגבורה. And also all the other names that he attributed to the Sefirot, it's not just him, it's longer traditions from the Zohar already. This is all true, of course. But again, you have to learn how to understand it properly. And if you don't understand it properly, you become very coarse, and you begin to become close to what we call duality. You begin to, or even polytheism in a certain sense. You think everything is separate. The whole point is to be able to, on the one hand, to understand the distinctions between the creations, to understand why God's name is attributed to certain creations, why this name is to this and this to that, without breaking God's unity. And that requires some explanation. That's what he's going to get into in the next 8 chapters.